Good morning. It's November 8th here in Seoul. We start with the headlines we're following at this hour. Israeli forces continue their offensive against Hamas, saying they're now in the heart of Gaza City. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once again says no ceasefire unless all the hostages are released. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to arrive in South Korea tonight. He's set to meet with Seoul's Foreign Minister Park Jin and President Yoon Suk-yeol to discuss Russia and North Korea's arms cooperation, among other issues. South Korean stocks plunged on the second day of the short-selling ban as foreign investors shifted into net sellers. This follows a surge on the first day, prompting another halt in trading, this time due to a fall. We start in Gaza, where Israeli forces continue their offensive against Hamas. The IDF says they're now in the heart of Gaza City, and over 14,000 Hamas targets have been hit. And amid the rising civilian death toll, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once again says no ceasefire unless all the hostages are released. Lee Seung-jae has more.
The Israeli military continues to push forward with their air and ground offensives, with Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announcing on Tuesday that the Israel Defense Forces troops are now in the heart of Gaza City. Gallant said the forces moved in with coordination from its Air Force and Navy. IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari reiterated Israel's stance that there will be no ceasefire as it continues with its offensives in the Gaza Strip. Answering calls for a humanitarian ceasefire and criticism that too many Palestinian civilians have been killed, Hagari said that the IDF has hit more than 14,000 Hamas targets in the region, destroyed more than 100 tunnels, and captured 4,000 weapons, which he said were hidden in civilian infrastructure. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also reiterated his stance on Tuesday that there will be no fuel delivered to Gaza, nor a ceasefire with Hamas, unless hostages seized by the Palestinian militant group are freed. The comments were made during a televised statement marking 1 month since Hamas launched an attack against Israel on October 7th. The Prime Minister also warned Iran-backed Hezbollah that it would be making the mistake of its life if it opens a new front in the armed conflict from its base in Lebanon. While Netanyahu called on Palestinian civilians to move south for their own safety, he made it clear that Israel will not stop with its offensives in the Gaza Strip. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Washington once again warned Israel against reoccupying Gaza following Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's comments that his country will have the overall security responsibility in Gaza for an indefinite period once armed conflict ends. Speaking to CNN, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said President Joe Biden does not believe the reoccupation of Gaza by Israeli forces is good for Israel or the Israeli people. Kirby said discussions over the post-war situation in the region took place during U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit to Israel. In an interview with CBS last month, Biden said it will be a big mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza. However, Biden reiterated his support for Israel and the right to defend itself during a call with Netanyahu on Monday. South Korea and Italy's heads of state will meet later today for summit talks in Seoul during Italian President Sergio Mattarella's 3-day state visit. According to the top office, President Yoon Suk-yeol will hold a welcoming ceremony at the Yongsan presidential office before their summit talks, which are expected to cover economic cooperation, science, technology, including space technology, as well as cultural and people-to-people exchanges. The leaders will also hold a signing ceremony for MOUs, and there will be a joint press briefing they will be announcing the outcomes. The Italian president touched down in the country on Tuesday at Seoul Air Base, South Korea being its first stop on its mission to strengthening Italy's interest in Asia and cooperation, what Italian media calls partners of great strategic importance. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to visit South Korea, with Russia and North Korea's military cooperation likely be discussed. He is expected to arrive in South Korea tonight after taking part in G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo. Blinken is scheduled to hold a meeting with his South Korean counterpart Park Jin on Thursday, and is also set to meet President Yoon Suk-yeol during his two-day visit. He will likely discuss measures to prevent North Korea's further arms cooperation with Russia, as well as ways to strengthen security and economic cooperation between Seoul and Washington. The top U.S. diplomat last visited South Korea in March 2021. And amid evolving threats from North Korea, South Korea says it has strengthened its extended deterrence against the regime this year through its cooperation with the United States, including joint exercises and the deployment of a U.S. ballistic missile submarine. Bae-eun-ji has the details.
South Korea and the U.S. have issued warnings to North Korea on 9 separate occasions so far this year, as they step up efforts to deter threats from Pyongyang. That's according to a report released by Seoul's defense ministry on Tuesday, which explained that U.S. forces stationed in South Korea and the deployment of U.S. strategic assets are a symbol of their extended deterrence against the North. On February 24th, South Korean and U.S. defense officials visited an American naval submarine base, Kings Bay, in Georgia. From March to July, the U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress engaged in combined aerial training exercises 5 times this year. The ministry explained that the B-52 bomber played a key role in enhancing the regular visibility of U.S. strategic assets on the Korean peninsula, as agreed by President Yoon Suk-yeol and U.S. President Joe Biden during their summit in April in Washington. Then in July, the U.S. Navy Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine, the USS Kentucky, visited Busan. A month after that, a B-52 bomber arrived at an airbase in Cheongju in a show of force against the North. This was the first time that the American strategic bomber had ever landed at a South Korean airbase. Lastly, South Korean and U.S. defense officials attended a test launch of Washington's Minuteman III ICBM in California last Wednesday. The defense ministry said this was the first time in 7 years and the second time ever that South Korean officials have attended an ICBM test launch by the U.S. Tuesday's report comes ahead of U.S. Defense Chief Lloyd Austin's visit to Seoul next week for an annual meeting with his South Korean counterpart, Shin Won-sik. Bae-eun-ji, Arirang News.
In 3 weeks, the host country for the 2030 World Expo will be decided, and South Korea will be making one final push for its bid to host a mega event in the coastal city of Busan. For more on Busan's prospects, we're joined by Samuel Richards, teaching professor of sociology at Penn State University. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now, Professor, about a month ago, you gave a speech promoting Busan's Expo Bid at the Busan Expo Symposium in Paris. Could you tell us about the key message of your speech?
Yes, my main message is that Busan and the Republic of Korea is the best of the 3 choices to hold World Expo 2030. And what I said was that the world is balancing precariously on the edge of a cliff with a wide range of social and environmental challenges ahead of us. And Korea can help us through these issues. And I've been saying this in many different venues, but we need countries, and we need a country in particular with high-tech abilities that can help us through some of these intractable problems. And Korea is a technology leader and a country that's developed its own technologies and doesn't rely on other countries to advance the many overlapping industries. So Korea is really the best choice.
Right. Major South Korean businesses are going all out promoting Busan's bid in Paris, where the BIE headquarters is located. Could you tell us some of the most notable campaigns and how much of an impact could they actually bring to the decision-making process?
Well, there's one happening right now, actually, the Invest Korea Summit 2023 campaign. And I think about 200 or 300 foreign investors in semiconductors and electric vehicles and secondary batteries and energy from over 30 countries are in Busan to explore business opportunities in Korea. And I think these kinds of campaigns have a great deal of value. I think, but honestly, I think it's the behind the scenes campaigning that's critical at this point. And there's just so many factors that come into play. You know, like President Yoon, Yoon's administration strengthened ties with the U.S. and Japan, but these have consequences for ties with China. And many people say that China is interfering in the World Expo voting. Well, Korea would say interfering. But, you know, had the Korean government strengthened ties with China, then perhaps the U.S. and Japan would not support the Korean World Expo bid. So, you know, it's very complicated, actually. But I think it's all behind the scenes at this point.
Right. The campaign itself, regardless of the voting outcome, must be serving a good chance for South Korea to promote its global prestige and its presence on a global stage. What would you say about this?
Well, you know, the World Expo bid's a net positive because the Republic of Korea is constantly in the news because of it and things related to the World Expo. And the bid demonstrates that the Korean government and the city of Busan are very forward thinking. So absolutely net positive. And, you know, it's clear from all of the presentations that have been happening around the world and all of the media that has been built around this Expo bid. And I think it's valuable because, you know, people are talking about Korea and the future because the World Expo represents the future. And so people are talking about that, and they're talking about technology and innovation. And of course, you know, Korea is a world leader in technology and innovation, as I just said. So it's absolutely a positive thing.
All right, finally, many are expecting a tie race between South Korea's Busan and Riyadh of Saudi Arabia until the very end. What would you say are the key factors that make Busan more suitable and more attractive candidate?
Well, you know, let me say that the Italians say that they're leading the voting, right? But from everybody I've spoken with, you know, here in the U.S. and in Korea, and while I was in France and in Paris, talking to many people who were at the symposium, it really is South Korea and Saudi Arabia. And, you know, Busan is a world-class city and one of the most important ports in all of Asia. And it's instrumental that the world invests in locations like Busan and that we continue to build an interconnected global economy to you know, get us through some of these intractable problems. And, you know, and speaking of that, you know, Korea is a country that's very forward-thinking about environmental issues, and Busan can play a pivotal role in the future. And that's not true of a mega investment in the middle of the desert, which is what the World Expo in Saudi Arabia would be in Riyadh. You know, it's not a place where people are going to return to far into the future. I mean, what would be the purpose of that? Whereas Busan is such a place, and I think it really represents the best of what the world can be.
All right, Professor, thank you for your insight this morning.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me to speak with your listeners and your viewers.
Thank you. South Korean stocks plunged on the second day of the short-selling ban as foreign investors shifted into net sellers. This follows a surge on the first day, prompting another halt in trading, this time due to a fall. Our Shina Young reports.
Stock markets here, which has surged significantly on Monday, lost momentum in just a single day. According to the Korea Exchange on Tuesday, South Korea's benchmark index, the KOSPI, dropped 2.33%, while the secondary Kosdaq market closed down 1.8%. This comes after a massive rally the previous day, which marked the first day of a complete ban on short selling. The decline was attributed to a drop in battery stocks and a shift among foreign investors into net sellers. During the session, trading on the tech-heavy Kosdaq had to be halted for a moment in the morning due to a different reason from the day before. According to the Korea Exchange, a sidecar curve was activated at 11:48 a.m. for 5 minutes when the Kosdaq 150 futures dropped more than 6% from its previous close, with the Kosdaq 150 index plunging about 3%. The sidecar limit is to mitigate volatility in stock markets and comes into play when the Kosdaq 150 futures fluctuates by more than 6% or when the Kosdaq 150 index moves more than 3%. This is in contrast to the previous day when the Kosdaq index rose sharply, triggering the activation of the sidecar curve for the first time in almost 3.5 years. Regarding the ban on the short selling of stock, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho said the same day that it was a necessary measure for now. He added that the government will continue with reform measures to win developed market status from Morgan Stanley Capital International. There has been rising concern over the ban as it is a key factor for MSCI to upgrade South Korea's status. Some experts believe that the momentum of short covering or buying back the borrowed shares in order to return them to the lender may have been exhausted. 신하영, Arirang News.
There are rising concerns over bedbugs in South Korea, with at least 30 cases having been reported as of Monday. To contain further infestation, authorities will conduct intense inspections and pest control on transportation and accommodation facilities for 4 weeks. Our Eun-hee reports.
South Korean authorities are fighting bedbugs amid growing public concern as the number of outbreaks, as reported by the Special Response Team on Monday, surpassed 30. The first outbreak was reported in September, which was followed by reports in 17 regions across South Korea, including cities and provinces. Earlier in November, the Ministry of the Interior and Safety launched a special response to contain the growing bedbugs infestations. However, as the number of outbreaks increased, the matter was elevated to be overseen by the Prime Minister's office. A decision was made in the first related meeting held on Tuesday to intensify inspections and pest control starting Monday, focusing on public transportation and accommodation facilities for 4 weeks. In response to concerns about the effectiveness of currently approved bedbug pesticides available domestically, the government has decided to promptly import alternatives. And on the back of reports of bedbug infestations in France and the UK, demand for bedbug repellent in the local market has surged on year. According to reports on Monday, sales of bedbug repellent increased by 813% from the end of October to the 6th of November. Sales of mattress vacuum cleaners also increased by 610%. In addition, demand for products like bedbug traps, which were not popular last year, has also increased. Bedbugs do not transmit disease. However, the bites from these blood-feeding insects can cause itching and lead to secondary skin infections due to scratching. Guidelines published by the government say that when bedbugs are discovered, the use of high-temperature steamers and repellents is effective. When bitten by bedbugs, it is advised to first wash the area with water and soap. A visit to the doctor may also be required depending on symptoms. Authorities are also advising that travelers thoroughly disinfect luggage before storing for an extended period as a way to eradicate them. Before the latest bedbug outbreak in South Korea, only 9 such reports have been submitted to the government since 2014. Eun-hee, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Kim Si-young, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin today in the UK with the state opening of Parliament on Tuesday by the new British monarch, King Charles III. In the first King's speech in more than 70 years, King Charles delivered the government's plans in a ceremony marking the first day of a new parliamentary session. In the speech, the King outlined Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's planned legislation, which included approval of new oil and gas development in the North Sea, curbing of smoking by minors, support for Ukraine and humanitarian aid to Gaza. King Charles made a special mention of South Korea's President Yoon and First Lady Kim, saying that he is looking forward and welcomes the South Korean state visit due later this month. President Yoon Suk-yeol will visit Britain this month at the invitation of King Charles III to mark the 140th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Korea and Britain. Now, moving over to Asia, where Myanmar's military government on Tuesday began its first joint naval exercise with Russia in the Andaman Sea. The 3-day joint maritime security exercise involving aircraft as well as naval vessels focuses on air, land, air and sea defense tactics. The drills will last until Thursday. Since Aung San Suu Kyi's elected government was ousted by the country's military in February 2021, Myanmar has seen the violent suppression of democratic protests, leading to thousands of deaths. Russia and China are a major weapons supplier of Myanmar's military government, with 28 Russian private and public companies transferring weapons such as advanced missile systems and fighter jets to the country since the 2021 coup d'etat. A UN human rights report on Myanmar's conditions in May outlined that Russia has supplied $406 million and China $267 million of weapons and material to Myanmar's military government since 2021. In the US, the co-working space company WeWork filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on Monday in New Jersey. After years of financial problems that has led to a net long-term debt of $2.9 billion and with over $13 billion of long-term leases, the cornered company stated that it is to raise about $3 billion of debt through a restructuring support agreement. WeWork, which as of June offered modern office spaces in 777 locations in 39 countries, was once hailed as an exemplary unicorn startup and valued as high as $47 billion. It suffered from a 98% decline in its share prices this year. Now, finally, in Europe, the French military leader Napoleon Bonaparte's hat is up for auction. The iconic bicorn black beaver felt hat is expected to fetch around $850,000 at auction. It has been the trademark of the late 18th and early 19th century leader's attire, along with his frock coat. Napoleon's hat will be on sale at the Osenat auction house in Fontainebleau, Paris on November 19th.
Good morning. Today is Ipdong, marking the onset of winter on the seasonal calendar. It surely is an early winter-like morning across Korea, with Seoul experiencing its first frost and ice of the season. Meanwhile, parts of Gyeongsang-do province have also been issued a cold wave advisory. Afternoon highs will at least go up to norms today, nearly 5 degrees higher than yesterday. So a morning winter jacket might feel too warm for today. Then Mother Nature will give us a respite from early winter weather tomorrow. Sunny skies to start off the day, then more clouds will be rolling in as the day goes on. Then highs will go up 4 to 5 degrees higher this afternoon in most parts of Korea. Seoul tops out at 15 degrees Celsius, Daegu, Gwangju at 18 degrees. Looking ahead, the early winter chill will return on Friday, and the weekend is set to be a freezing one, with morning temperatures dropping to sub-zero levels here in Korea, so please stay warm. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That is all for today. Thanks for watching.
Welcome. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴.
24시간 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟.
휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
We deliver stories on site. From Korea to the world, and from the world to Korea. We ask questions every day that could change the world. Taking news a step further, Arirang News. You're watching Arirang News. You're watching Arirang.
What would you say in Korean in this exact situation? Find out in K-Chat, conversing in Korean.
Are you working in Korea?
Oh, that's a very
Keeping close tabs on you.
Korea hydro and nuclear power envisions a world flowing with energy as clean as the blue skies, where we can enjoy energy without worrying about the planet by finding new alternative sources to achieve carbon neutrality through clean, carbon-free energy. KHNP is creating a new future for a carbon-free world. Korea hydro and nuclear power.
웰컴. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
한국에 오면 먹어야죠.
먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation. Making news just for you. It's November 8th here in Seoul. I'm Shin-Yoon, and you're watching News Generation. Joining me in the studio is Cheska Dainong.
Happy Wednesday, everyone.
Happy Wednesday. And Chiji.
Good morning.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, temperatures have suddenly dropped here in the capital. Morning temperatures on Tuesday hovered around 1 to 12 degrees Celsius, which was much lower than the day before when they ranged from 6.5 to 13.5 degrees. This November has relatively been warm compared to previous years. Following Tuesday's sudden drop in temperatures, though, people have taken out their thick sweaters and padded coats, hinting that it's the start of winter. And speaking of winter, a must-eat Korean street food during this time of the year is 붕어빵. It's a fish-shaped pastry filled with sweet red bean paste, and won 붕어빵 used to cost around 77 cents. But now, with rising food and energy prices, we've seen prices nearly double. To explain in more depth, we've seen domestic prices for the red beans used for this snack soar by 33% compared to last year. And Chinese President Xi Jinping recently reiterated what a woman should be doing for society. His exact words were, women have a critical role and must establish a new trend of family amid the country's aging population and record decline in birth rate. The Chinese president stressed that a woman must also prioritize family harmony and national development, which could be fostered through a new outlook on marriage and childbearing. Now, China did see its first population drop in 6 decades in January. Over the last 2 years, officials have been implementing various measures to bring the birth rate up. And that includes giving out financial incentives and boosting childcare facilities. But some are analyzing that Xi Jinping made somewhat of an insensitive or backwarded comment regarding what a Chinese woman should do, as the country is failing to see demographic-related stats bounce back as quickly as hoped for. So here in the studio, Chi, what did you think about Xi Jinping's comments?
Well, President Xi's comments definitely reflect the country's concern for the current demographic challenges, and his emphasis on women's role in helping out with the balance of family harmony, as well as encouraging more children, birth of children, could be seen as an attempt to really encourage and raise awareness of this issue. However, some critics may argue that his comments are rather traditionalist and regressive in terms of gender roles, because it's putting an additional pressure on just women in promoting the harmony of family and prioritizing family issues over careers and aspirations. So his comments are really going in the other direction of the change that we would like to see today in society.
And I think our generation is more sensitive about what traditional gender roles are. Is there even a concept of traditional gender roles, given that anyone could be whatever they can be, regardless of who they are biologically born as? Now, what did you think about Xi's comments?
I do agree with some of the comments that Xi also made. I understand that Xi Jinping was probably trying to encourage and promote increase in birth rate, as in global there's a declining birth rate. However, it can be seen as a bit controversial, of course, because as we discussed in a previous episode for low fertility rate, family plan is a very personal and private matter. And just by adding a digit to the entire population does not solve problems. If anything, it can also add problems such as crime issues, environmental issues, and many that kind of extrapolate beyond just those. I mean, even speaking from a psychological standpoint, a lot of the juvenile and even legal age crimes that are committed result from deeply rooted family issues.
Right.
So, just purely enforcing families to have more children or encouraging families to have children when they're not ready could potentially have effect on unforeseen problems.
Exactly, and I completely agree. Though it's a personal issue, I do understand at the same time how the public is trying to be involved with it, because it's demographics we're talking about, and it does affect society as a whole. And that was our news feed for this Wednesday, and let's now switch gears into our main discussion topic of the day, my AI voice secretary with more.
Roughly a month has passed since Palestinian militant group Hamas launched a brutal attack against Israel, killing more than 1,000 and taking hundreds hostage. Since then, Israel declared war on Hamas, pledging to eliminate the Islamist militant group. But Israel's attacks on targets in Gaza have led to thousands of civilian deaths. According to Gaza's health ministry, over 10,000 Palestinians have since been killed in Gaza. This includes over 4,000 children. With innocent civilians suffering, some are pointing to neighboring countries to step up and accept them as refugees.
Since the war broke out between Israel and Hamas, more than 1.4 million people have been displaced inside Gaza. But it's not the first time we've seen violence erupt in this area. So, Chihi, why don't you tell us about how the UN is viewing this refugee crisis, which has spurred from the war at the moment?
Well, first of all, according to an Israeli newspaper, which was reported on the 23rd of October, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has resulted in the displacement of 1.4 million refugees in Gaza and 200,000 people in Israel. And however, the current estimate suggests that the number of refugees can, of course, get even higher than that. And about half of them have sought refuge in the homes of their relatives in other regions, and others are staying in UNHCR schools as well. And the ongoing crisis in the Gaza Strip has been described by the UN's independent human rights expert as a quote-unquote political and humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. And also the UN Secretary General has also made two strong humanitarian appeals, stating that the Middle East is on the verge of the abyss. And he's called upon Hamas to immediately release all its hostages without any condition, and for Israel to grant rapid and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid as well for the civilians in the Gaza region.
And though it's been a long time since we've seen this refugee crisis, it's happening as we're speaking, right? Would you like to add on?
Absolutely. The Palestinian refugee issue is actually a very long-standing crisis, as we know historically, that has endured since the tumultuous events of the first Middle East conflict back in 1948. Now, according to the United Nations, the number has swelled to a total of staggering 6 million, and they are spread across Middle Eastern countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Now, the anguish of the situation is even more heightened as some refuse to actually leave the country and would rather risk their lives living in the area. Now, even those that have left to seek asylum face profound uncertainty as they can't secure any proper jobs or property in the new host country.
Exactly, and refugees from the Israel-Hamas war are just the tip of an iceberg. Recently, over in Spain, the Interior Ministry saw that the Canary Islands saw a record number of migrants. At least 32,029 people landed on the islands from January to November 5th, most coming from Senegal. So what's the global refugee count as we're speaking, and what caused them to flee their home country, Cheska?
Sure. As you mentioned, this is an ongoing and very serious world crisis that needs attention and global support. Now, if we take a look at the screen, we've prepared some stats to illustrate the current situation. Now, as of last year, there were 184 million refugees worldwide, marking the highest increase in refugee numbers since the tracking actually began. Now, if we count that, that is approximately about one refugee for every 74 people in the global population. Now, what makes the situation more alarming and critical is that almost half of those are children who are most vulnerable and desperately require protection. And it is very possible that the numbers can actually be much higher because in situations like this, it is extremely difficult to follow up in hostile war zones and refugee camps. And as we saw in the stats, refugees include women, children and elderly that require urgent need for very comprehensive solution for vulnerable individuals who are exposed to danger every single day.
Right, so I completely agree. We're seeing the latest batch of refugees from the Israel-Hamas war, also the Ukrainian war, and the refugee crisis isn't just limited to one region. We're seeing it globally happening everywhere. But a big issue is that neighboring countries don't seem to be as welcoming or open to the concept of letting these refugees in, right? So tell us more about that.
Right, so the refugee issue is a pressing and controversial issue, especially in Europe right now. The number of refugees arriving in the region has in fact increased by 83% compared to the year before, and those who are against accepting refugees in their countries often argue for three different arguments. First of all, it being security risks, and secondly, economic burdens. Thirdly, the challenges in cultural and social integration, and last but not least, limited resources. Now, the European Union has implemented a mandatory quota system for asylum seekers based on their population as well as their GDP size, along with substantial funding for those who get rejected. And this is all, of course, in the effort to reduce address the refugee crisis. However, due to the recent wave of terrorist attacks by the extremists and growing concerns over illegal immigration, there's now a push to close borders within some of these countries as well.
Which is quite devastating if you think about it, because that could be an overgeneralization too. I do understand the three reasons why countries might be against it, as you mentioned, security, economy, and integration.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think that sometimes we look at one terror attack and then associate it to all the refugees out there, when sometimes there's no causality. But to better find out about the pressing refugee crisis around the world, let's now include an expert in our talks. So we started today's discussion by talking about the Israel-Hamas war and the refugee crisis. That's why we're now going to include a senior advocate for the Middle East from Refugees International. It's Jesse Marks. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you for having me.
Good morning.
All right, Jesse, I'd like to ask you the first question. What's the biggest problem refugees around the world are going through at the moment?
I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important to look at the scale of displacement, both refugees, but also those who are internally displaced in their country. Currently, over the last decade, the number has skyrocketed. It's almost 100 million people globally who are now displaced. And the drivers of displacement are deeply connected, ranging from war, as you all discussed, but also more emerging challenges like climate change. Unfortunately, war and conflicts continue to fuel displacement, as we're seeing in Gaza. A surge in new or a resumption of previous crises are pushing millions into deeper uncertainty. Many of these are widely reported, like Gaza, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Syria. But many of these are largely absent from international media attention, right? There are skyrocketing levels of displacement as a result of violence and state fragility across Africa. For example, in the Congo or Ethiopia or across the Sahel. One of the challenges we're seeing now is record levels of displacement are also accompanied by more intensive violence against civilians and displaced populations. Look at Sudan. In West Darfur, for example, we're seeing troubling reports of ethnically driven violence from folks who are fleeing the region, which several decades ago faced one of the worst genocides in a generation. And this violence touches the entirety of the family, but it has distinct impacts on women, children, and protected minority groups who have specific, unique protection concerns in many of these areas.
You know, in situations like these, I think refugee hosting countries are extremely vital for the survival of refugees that seek asylum. However, I'm sure the countries also have their own struggles internally and both externally. Could you elaborate on those, please?
Certainly. I mean, the concept of durable solutions, which the UN identifies as the lasting solutions for displaced communities, have largely stalled. There are two primary types of receiving countries. First, those who refugees initially flee to at the instance of displacement. So in Syria, those would be neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. In the case of Gaza, that would be Egypt. And then you have resettlement countries, which are the destination countries that many refugees themselves are seeking. That could be Europe, the US, and Canada. Most countries who initially receive refugees are themselves often facing severe economic, development, and humanitarian challenges, and in most cases lack the funding. Many of these refugee responses to support these countries are ill-equipped and underfunded, and the UN often has to do more with less. As a result, many refugees in refugee-hosting countries often choose to make more dangerous journeys from these countries toward more desirable places like Europe. And we see this with refugees currently fleeing Syria to neighboring countries for Europe, as well as increased numbers of refugees fleeing conflicts in Africa for Europe, as you mentioned previously with the case in West Africa. Meanwhile, with resettlement countries, destination countries are increasingly closing their door. It's not for a lack of capacity. In fact, many of these countries have the ability, whether it's the US, EU, Canada, but it's often about political will. And increasingly over the last 5 years, we've seen the viable legal pathways for people to leave resettlement countries diminish drastically.
Well, as you said, it seems as though political will is really important, as well as the actual resources that a country has to accept more refugees. It's a really complex matter, but why does our generation in particular, why should we keep an eye on this whole refugee crisis, do you think?
I think the short answer is we are the ones who are going to inherit these crises, right? The world is increasingly mobile and populations are moving. I mean, our generation is going to inherit the many conflicts that are happening now, but also the new drivers of displacement like climate change. And there's a large amount of debate happening within the UN about how we address and tackle those issues. One way, providing solutions to protracted displacement refugees begins by, first and foremost, engaging with refugees themselves, right? Shifting resources into the hands of displaced communities and groups that are responding to their needs. This is a huge segment of the displaced population, are youth, right? How do we invest in those youth to help meet the challenges in their communities, right? And I think the key thing really is our generation needs to be the drivers of change when it comes to shifting how we view refugees. The traditional perception is that refugees themselves are burdens, right? We have this mental image of people in a camp, but realistically, at the end of the day, refugees themselves are people just like us. They are economic assets. They are humans. They are communities that are futures. And at the end of the day, it is our generation which will assume leadership over these issues. And it's an opportunity for us to reshape that perception and help provide lasting solutions to their communities.
Definitely, Jesse. I can't agree with you more. I think we need to not only accept, but understand how we can better integrate these refugees into our lives, because that's the reality we're in. We're seeing so many displaced populations and communities. Learning how to use them for, whether that be for our own national benefit or better harmony, is key. And I hope our generation can lead that. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jesse.
And now I'd like to focus this part of our discussion into finding out how we can better accept and welcome refugees into our lives. And we first asked our viewers this question, so take a look at the screen to find out what 3 of them had to say. Let's start with Dona. Dona said, the war in Europe changed everything all around the world. In Romania, there's lots of Ukrainian refugees. They received help from the government, a place to stay, food, and medicine. Arch said, the Australian government treats boat arrivals as illegal maritime arrivals and currently denies them permanent protection visas. We only accept onshore and offshore, which are refugee status decided overseas programs. Tasmia said, in the Bangladesh, we have the Rohingya refugees. They're facing overcrowded camps and increased insecurity. It's sad to see that they're the world's largest stateless population. Now, we can see that the refugee crisis is ongoing around the world. We kept mentioning that, but I think this part of the discussion now needs to focus on what countries that are receiving them need to be better aware of. So let's start with how Korea is like when it comes to accepting these refugees.
Right. Well, first of all, Korea was in fact the first country in Asia to actually enact a refugee law, and that was back in 2012. And also last year, the Korean government has contributed about $30 million to UNHCR, and the private sector has done more contribution. That was $50 million. What's unusually surprising is that private donations were a lot higher than the government contributions. And this could be a reflection that individuals are really willing to support these refugees. However, the actual refugee recognition rate is still very low. It stands at 2.6% in the country, which is less than 1/10 of that of the OECD countries as of now. And in fact, back in 2018, we had the whole controversy over accepting Yemeni refugees. Back then, the public was very cautious and very concerned about the social integration matter, as well as security matters. And in fact, the public opinion was very divided, and there wasn't a widespread acceptance or support for increasing the actual number of refugees that we admit.
Right, and I do think perspectives have changed since. If you remember last year, once the Taliban took over, a lot of refugees, around 400 were accepted to be allowed here in Korea. And then the public opinion, I remember, it was split, but compared to 2018, though, I do think we've seen some progress. And if you'd like to add on to what you think about South Korean society accepting these refugees.
As Jihi mentioned, I actually learned about this for the first time. I'm quite proud that we were the first Asian country to actually, at least participate in accepting refugees. However, I'm going to be a little honest here. As much as I'm of the opinion that we should lend our hands to, in the time of global crisis, as we have also received much support in times of need, I think the prevailing opinion in South Korea still has been on the more restrictive and sometimes, I'm sad to admit, antagonistic towards foreigners just in general. I understand the situations and the complicated matters as it is political and socio-economic, but I truly do hope that, as Jesse mentioned, that this is not just something that is happening to others. This is happening to all of us, and this is a problem that we will inherit, basically. So I do hope that in due time our society evolves and sort of embraces the important leadership and support supporting the global crisis altogether.
Right, and I think for like all the topics that we cover on News Gen, our generation plays an integral part in solving this. And that's why my last question for you both is, how should our generation try to tackle this ongoing crisis then?
Well, I want to suggest two ways in which we as the millennials and Gen Z can tackle this ongoing refugee issue. First of all, it would be advocacy and awareness. We could really make use of our digital and social media skills to really change the perception as well as raise awareness of this issue. As Jessie said, until now we've thought of refugees only as a burden, but if we think about it on a positive perspective, they are economic assets.
They are.
They are just people like us, and we have the responsibility to take care of them as well, because our generation will be inheriting this crisis, just like the climate change issue.
Exactly. Exactly.
And secondly, volunteering and support would be one other way we can engage in. We can volunteer for organizations to help support them, and we can also make donations or engage in fundraising initiatives to actually provide direct support for those who are in need.
What about you, Cheska?
I agree with everything that she said, and I love the two-step sort of manual that we can follow. But to add on to that, all the things that she mentioned and more, I think our generation has done and has shown proof that our generation has this incredible power that we have demonstrated over and over again, just to name, including the Turkey earthquake and many other social causes that our generation is sort of driving the force forward. So I think it is very, very important that we understand that now global struggles are completely borderless, and as we have repeatedly mentioned, this is a problem that we will have to inherit and deal with and solve, so that each and every one of us sort of take that leadership. And then I hope our generation can lead the way in starting a more open and respectful conversation to become true leaders of the new generation.
Of the new generation, which is powered by the fact that we're living in a borderless society. All issues are very interconnected. We're all global citizens here. And also remembering the fact that refugees aren't burdens, they could be assets and our neighbors. And we'll try to deliver that message to you more here on News Gen. Until then, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Cheska Dainhong.
Pleasure's always mine. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are News Generation.
Welcome. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's calling? Make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
Welcome.